One of my favorite things to do this time of year is to go out for a run really, really early when it's still pitch dark. Sometimes I see Vince out there walking. Aside from my flashing lights, you can't see anything. I have this especially satisfying 7-mile loop that seems to be choreographed precisely to the season. When I start out, I'm very much in my own world as my muscles and mind begin to come awake. I listen to my feet as they hit the pavement, and like most runners, I often count out a cadence to myself, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, with the 3 coinciding with the alternating foot strike on the road, to increase cadence and to keep good form. And as I run, I begin to notice invisible smells of the cow pasture on my left, the sounds of the water running in the dark enshrouded paddock on my right, as the snow melt runs downhill in tiny, impromptu streams. As I run, I discover that beauty is silently entering into my consciousness. This past Monday, as I ran, I was meditating on this week's scriptures, and they all seemed to come alive during my run. As I started out in the darkness, the reading from Genesis was much in my mind, as if this was the darkness before the very first day of creation. And I felt my body anticipating the light, and yet my eyes could only see the darkness. As I left Route 60 and began the ascent up Moon Road, the familiar sounds and smells assaulted my senses, and I felt peace in the midst of the darkness. It was sometime during my descent down West Elk Hill Road that I discovered that my silent cadence that I'd been counting in my head, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, had changed. I was no longer counting numbers, but repeating a mantra to myself. You are loved. You are loved. My meditations about the baptism of Jesus in the gospel had quietly acquiesced upon the words that Jesus hears spoken from heaven. You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. And I had turned them into a practice that my spiritual director and life coach had encouraged me to engage in. To take 30 minutes a day and to saturate myself in the presence of God's loving embrace by simply repeating to myself the phrase, I am loved. Of course, I had resisted the practice because it felt so awkward and self-indulgent. And so I was startled to find myself so naturally in the midst of it on this run. And it was about this moment precisely when I noticed that I felt a presence quite near me, as if someone were right behind me, maybe running with me. And so I quickly glanced over each shoulder, subtly to see who might be there, only to discover that no one was there. And then it dawned on me where this feeling was coming from. Literally, it dawned on me that the dawn had broken, and there was just enough crepuscular light for my peripheral vision to be awakened. I had emerged from the tunnel vision of darkness, and I felt the world emerging all around me, coming to life, a world of new possibility. I literally felt like I had seen the heavens torn apart. I share this experience because it felt like a revelation when another world of possibility dawned in my understanding. I wonder if you've ever had a similar experience. Maybe out in nature on a walk, maybe in an intimate moment with a loved one, where everything just seemed to make sense for a brief moment. And you experienced peace, unexpectedly palpable in your own body, where God didn't just live in the beauty of the church or of nature, but God lived in the beauty of you, in the moment of your own consciousness. During my run this past week, I felt like I was baptized into the fuller meaning of what baptism is all about. Normally, we associate baptism with the forgiveness of sins, as John the Baptist does in this week's gospel. course, we also claim that baptism is an identification of death to self and a rebirth into the new life in Christ. It is the former reality, however, that makes this particular story about John's baptism so problematic for us and to our minds. I mean, why, after all, does the sinless Son of God need a baptism for the forgiveness of sins? Of course, this has troubled Christians since the very beginning. And it was quite contentious in the 4th century as the church councils were trying to codify and articulate Jesus' special divine human nature. And they got in some quite serious fights that are probably on par with the reality that we experience today. But that's beyond the scope today. On Monday's run, I experienced in my very body the heart of what baptism is all about. I'd like to think that my baptized life came into a new and deeper reality this past week. Because apart from the forgiveness of sin and the rebirth to a fresh start, baptism is something different. It also offers the constant blessing of God's affirmation of us, all of us, as God's beloved child. And I felt the enormity of this revelation on Monday. So I wanted to share it with you. For those words that the voice from the heaven addressed to Jesus are also addressed to us. They're addressed to you. You are my child, my beloved. And with you, I am well pleased. Take a moment. Listen for God speaking that to you. Because it's true. You are God's child, beloved. God's pleased with you. It is these words that start Jesus' ministry. These words that equip him to deal with temptation. These words that orient his mission and anchor his ministry. These words give him an unassailable identity that makes, well, everything possible. And the same can be true of us. Can be true of us. I'd like to say is true, except that baptism is one of those things that is both an objective and subjective reality. Objectively, we're absolutely God's beloved child. No doubt about it. This is the promise of baptism. This is the heart of it all. But subjectively, we may or may not know that reality. We may or may not believe it to be true. We may or may not feel it to be true. And subjectively, baptism becomes so much more important to us as we remember that and we put it to use on a daily basis. Baptism isn't a one-and-done reality. It's a reality that is meant to be brought new and fresh every morning. Because baptism gives us an unassailable identity as well. Whereas so much else in our life describes us, our occupation, our race, ethnicity, our gender and sexuality, our life experiences, both good and bad, our passions and interests and commitments. It's our status as God's beloved children that defines who we are and what we are. It's not that those things don't matter. They do, very much so. But it's that none of these things are as important as our identity as God's beloved child, as a physical manifestation of love, God's love, first to ourselves and then to those around us. As humans, this sense of identity, we know it's true in our family lives too. We know that we're objectively loved in our heads. We know that our spouses love us, that our children love us, that our parents love us. But we have to find that reality subjectively in our own hearts. We can't just live in our heads. As a father and as a son, and as a husband, I know this to be so true. I have 2 boys, who are both different in so many, many ways. And those differences are interesting and wonderful and sometimes quite challenging. But it does not affect just how much I love each of them. And if there's anything that will get them through this life, it's not any of those distinctive characteristics, their inherent skills or talents, which are important, but rather knowing that they are completely and fully loved and accepted for whom they are, including and sometimes in spite of those many differences. As I say to my boys, when I know they felt the blessings of love and of a secure identity, you are blessed. Now go be a blessing for others. I say that same thing to you this morning. You've been blessed with every spiritual gift, blessed as God's own child. Now go be a blessing for God's other children. All blessings, especially those that powerfully endue us with identity, also come with great responsibility. You see, our baptism empowers us to see others as the beloved child and to treat them as such. This responsibility is that we may not always want to see others as beloved children of God, particularly when they're different from us in any of those important but merely descriptive attributes. And this is particularly the case when we've let those important but merely descriptive attributes not just describe us, but define us, perhaps to hold us captive. It's not just a responsibility, this blessing of baptism. It's also an invitation to realize what a larger and more interesting family we have when we see God's other children, when we see that it's everybody. As I watched the events of this past Wednesday unfold, as I reflected over the last few months and indeed years, it occurred to me that we all are suffering from an acute identity crisis. You see, we've let our regional or political or ideological commitments, which are important, so define us to the point that it's so very easy to see someone else who differs from us along any of those other lines as threatening, to make them the enemy. We are at a place, a cultural place, and a moment when the question of the citizens of this country is, can you differ with another person on important issues and still see that person as an American? And for us Christians, the task and calling is even greater. Can you see someone who differs from you, from whom you definitely disagree on important issues, as a fellow child of God? Much hangs in the balance on how we answer those questions. But lest we feel daunted by the challenge, we might remind each other that regardless of whether we're confused about our identities, and though we will regularly fall short of God's desire for us and how we regard each other, yet still, we are God's beloved children, beloved of God. And that very fact, that identity, grants us the grace and gives us the strength to try again and again and again. This past week, we witnessed a dark and turbulent moment in our national life together. It's natural after such turbulent events to want to make sense of what happened. When we begin to fashion a narrative and to make meaning, it's easy to begin to point fingers and to want to allocate blame. But that only spreads more darkness. We must choose the light. We must find the light in the midst of the darkness. I want to invite you to embrace the blessing of your own identity as God's beloved child, shining brightly in the darkness, by closing with a blessing by the poet John O Donohue. He writes, May the beauty of your life become more visible to you, that you may glimpse your wild divinity. May the wonders of the earth call you forth from all your small secret prisons and set your feet free in the pastures of possibilities. May the light of dawn anoint your eyes, that you may behold what a miracle a day is. May the liturgy of twilight shelter all your fears and darkness within the circle of ease. May the angel of memory surprise you in bleak times with new gifts from the harvest of your vanished days. May you allow no dark hand to quench the candle of hope in your heart. May you discover a new generosity towards yourself and encourage yourself to engage your life as a great adventure. May the outside voices of fear and despair find no echo in you. May you always trust the urgency and wisdom of your own spirit. May the shelter and nourishment of all the good you've done, the love you have shown, the suffering you have carried, awaken around you to bless your life 1,000 times. And when love finds a path to your door, may you open like the earth to the dawn and trust your every hidden color towards its nourishment of light. May you find enough stillness and silence to savor the kiss of God on your soul and delight in the eternity that shaped you, that holds you and calls you. May you know that despite confusion, anxiety, and emptiness, your name is written in heaven. And may you come to see your life as a quiet sacrament of service, which awakens around you a rhythm where doubt gives way to the grace of wonder, where what is awkward and strained can find elegance, and where crippled hope can find wings, and torment enter at last into the grace of serenity. May divine beauty bless you. May divine beauty bless you this day as you embrace your identity as God's own beloved. My brothers and sisters, you are loved. Amen.